So it's right about 1 o'clock, so I'm just gonna introduce Scott. It seems most of you already know him, but I just wanna make a note that today's program was sponsored by the Friends of the Deland Library, which made the funding for this program possible. Please support the Friends at their monthly book sale, which next month is July 12th and 13th, and every weekday at the bookstore next door. When you purchase from them, you're supporting programs and events like this. Scott is clearly famous to you all, so I will allow him to introduce himself, and thank you all very much for coming.
All right, so yeah, my name is Scott Ostuni. My full-time job is being a mycologist. I work as a sequence validator for a couple different labs across the United States. One of them being Fundus, or the Fungal Diversity Survey. They're based in California, and right now their goal is to outline all macrofungi in the state of California. And so I work remotely analyzing all the DNA sequences for the state of California. I also do this for another organization called the Ohio Mushroom DNA Lab, which offers free DNA sequencing for anyone in North America, as well as select other countries like Australia and India. And I also do this for mycology Labs, which is based in Michigan as well. As far as my primary interest in mushrooms, my focus is on taxonomy, which is the classification of these organisms, as well as resurrecting a lot of old names for mushrooms that have been lost to history. So I spend a lot of time at the University of Florida Fungarium looking at 100-year-old collections under a microscope in order to hopefully bring back old names that we don't use anymore. I'm also a member of the, oh, nice. Hello, perfect. I'm also a member of NPM, or the Entheogen Genome Project, and our goal with that is to do full genome sequencing on all psychoactive organisms on the planet, and we are starting with the fungi. And yeah. And I'm also a member of the North American Mycological Association's DNA sequencing committee. Yeah, so today's talk is going to be common edible mushrooms in Florida, and I'll touch lightly on how to identify them. It seems like a good amount of you do have experience collecting mushrooms in the field and even eating them, but I didn't want to assume everyone was at this level, so I'm not going to go too deep into the nuanced diagnostic features of mushrooms. I'm just going to kind of present a couple pretty easy to identify and common mushrooms that you can usually identify just based on the gestalt or vibe of the mushroom. So I'm going to start with my favorite edible mushroom here in Florida. This is Chanterelles cocolobe, or the common name for them is Seagrape chanterelles. So throughout all of South Florida, along the coast, you have these seagrape trees that line the beach. And we have this mushroom, the chanterelle mushroom, that has a mycorrhizal association with the trees, meaning it has a symbiotic relationship. So the mycelium of this fungus sheath around the roots of the trees, and there's a mutualistic exchange of nutrients and moisture, etc. And you know, I've collected chanterelles all over the United States, and this one is definitely, in my opinion, the best tasting. It also has the potential to grow in really fat clusters, where other species of chanterelles tend to grow solitarily or singularly, or maybe two at a time. But these you can pick these almost foot-wide clusters of them, so that's really neat. Like I said, they're found growing with the seagrape trees. The original description of them describes them as having this salmon pink to almost orange color, and for the most part, that's what you'll see when you find these, but I have a secret spot in Palm Beach County, Florida, where in this extremely small area, I find a variety of colors. I think there's like 3 or 4 different color variants that I find here, which is really interesting because I've scavenged through Seagrapes throughout all of South Florida, and typically I only see the pink variety. And yeah, they typically start to fruit in July and it'll go through October, but I've seen them as early as May and as late as January, at least in like the Miami area, you'll see it later on the further south you go. But you'll see they don't have the typical gills that you see with, say, like portobello mushrooms, where there's these like kind of blade-like structures under the cap. They have what we call melted gills, and they're almost like melting into one another. Another interesting feature, when you pull them apart, they pull apart just like string cheese. And this is one of the kind of discerning features about these. A lot of the lookalikes or potential lookalikes don't have this characteristic. So it's a pretty easy one to identify. It also tends to smell fruity. Some people say specifically like apricots. I don't know if I get that, but it definitely has a fruity smell. And if you bite into it raw, it's a little spicy. And then yeah, so at least in Florida here, this is the distribution. So it seems, at least according to iNaturalist, so it seems to go as far north as Port St. Lucie, or the north end of Lake Okeechobee, and then down through the Keys. But that seems to be its cutoff point, is Martin County. And then, so yeah, these are the different color variants I was talking about. So, you've got the typical salmon pink one, which you can see in the basket, but then at my secret spot, I've also got these like really bright orange to almost sometimes gold colored ones, as well as an albino variant. And so when I started finding this albino variant, I had been picking the pink version for a while. And so I was like, all right, what the heck is happening? Are these like different species growing in the same place? And so I actually ended up sending the albino collection to at least this country's chanterelle expert. Her name's Rachel Sweeney. She's at University of Tennessee. And she was really interested in it, and she ended up doing some microscopy and DNA sequencing on it. And I mean, it's the same organism. But at this one location, it's expressing albinoism, which is pretty interesting. And to my knowledge, it's the only spot in the world that produces this albino variant. So that's pretty cool that we have that here in Florida. All right, another chanterelle. Another thing about chanterelles, so who here has heard of chanterelles or has eaten them? Okay, so chanterelles, getting to like a species level identification is extremely difficult. They all look pretty much the same. There's some exceptions that make it easier to ID, like the Chanterelles cocolobe, because they have this strict mycorrhizal host, being the seagrape trees, and no other chanterelles grow with the seagrapes. So those are pretty easy to identify. But when it comes to other chanterelles, especially in like mixed woods, they're all pretty much going to look like this, kind of like an orange color. And honestly, the only way to distinguish them is through really intense microscopy or DNA sequencing. In this case, I actually did get these DNA sequenced, and these are Chanterelles altipes. They don't have a common name as far as I'm aware. But they are pretty widespread, and probably more so than this map is suggesting. Just because, like I said, they're extremely hard to ID to species level resolution. So I imagine they're all over the East Coast and probably go west to Texas, up to Missouri, potentially Iowa. But this kind of just represents the observations that we're able to get to species level identification. And here's some more pictures. These pictures were taken in South Florida, in Palm Beach Gardens, if anyone's familiar. So another one, Lactarius indigo, or indigo milk caps. Is anyone here familiar with these? Yeah. So these, in my opinion, are kind of, I wouldn't consider them a choice edible. I've eaten them a couple times and they're okay. To me, they're kind of on par with like portobello. But one interesting thing about these is they do stain everything blue that they touch, and so you can make blue eggs and ham with them. And they also lactate, or when you damage the gills, and I don't think there's any examples here, but if you were to like slice the gills horizontally, it would kind of bleed or lactate this like white milky substance. And it's, as far as Florida's concerned, and I'm aware, it's the only truly blue mushroom that you'll find. So this one is pretty easy to identify. There are other mushrooms that can bruise blue, including bolete mushrooms, as well as some of the psilocybin containing mushrooms. But this is the only one from the get-go, undamaged, is like truly blue. So it's a pretty easy one to identify. And yeah, these are extremely widely distributed all over the United States. All right, oyster mushrooms. There's a lot of species of oysters, probably more than we're currently aware of, and every day, maybe not every day, but occasionally we do find new species. Actually, just a couple, 1 or 2 months ago, I got some sequencing data back on one I collected here in Deland, and it didn't seem to match anything. So we potentially have a couple undescribed species here, but as far as the ones that do have names, we have about 4 or 5 named species here in Florida. They're often found growing on decaying wood. You can find them year-round as long as the conditions are right and it's nice and wet. Extremely easy to cultivate. I'm sure a lot of you have seen them at like farmers markets or grown them yourselves. And then yeah, these are also extremely widely distributed, and you know they come in a lot of different color variants. And yeah. Then here's some pictures. The one in the top right, I actually found at what's it called? Rainbow Springs. And then I took a spore print of it and I ended up cultivating it at home. And so that's the bottom right picture. And it's interesting because, you know, when I found it, it had like closer to like a pallid gray to white coloration. But once I cultivated it, it took on like more of a gray-brown color in the cap. And I assume it's just sort of environmental. You know, the one I cultivated, I had outside kind of in direct sunlight, which might have increased the pigmentation. And when I originally found it at Rainbow Springs, it was extremely shaded, no direct sunlight, you know, under a canopy. And then the one on the left is actually one I found in Washington State. All right, the next one, Macrosity titans, or the American titan. So this one I actually just found last week for the first time, which was really exciting. I found it in South Florida, but it grows all throughout Florida, as well as Texas, maybe Louisiana and Mississippi, as well as Mexico, if I'm not mistaken. This one, I personally don't know anyone who has consumed it, but at least according to certain field guides, it is edible. I don't know how good of an edible it is, but it has the potential to be extremely large. So this collection here, I mean, they were a decent size, maybe like a foot tall by, you know, the cap was maybe half a foot wide. But I've seen pictures of them like up to 3 foot wide caps and like maybe 2 feet tall. So that they can get extremely large, and I hope one day I find one that big.
Do you have an underside picture?
Unfortunately, I don't.
Is
But
it just regular gills?
yeah, it is just regular gills. I actually do have pictures of the underside. I just didn't put them in here.
What's it like to grow in? Like dead trees?
So this one was actually really interesting. So this was in like extremely well-maintained kind of high-end neighborhood in South Florida, where they have like oak trees just like in like, I don't know, 100-foot intervals in grass. But then this one tree at the base had this cover of some kind of ivy, I believe, and it was just poking out through that. But typically when I see photos online, they're just growing in grass. So I actually wonder if the whole like ivy thing, if it was like creating like an ideal microclimate for it to fruit in, or what the deal was, if there's any association at all there. Like I said, this is the first time I found it, so I'm really not sure.
Was it in shade or?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, they had these oak trees kind of scattered through this neighborhood, and it was a rainy, overcast day, so it was pretty shaded, but I've definitely seen them in just like, at least pictures of them in open lawns growing in direct sun. And then, yeah, okay, well, apparently it's been found as far north as South Carolina and the Atlanta area, but you can see it's a primarily tropically distributed species, all the way east to BVI and west to Mexico. All right, wood ears, or Auricularia species. Has anyone heard of wood ears?
I've seen them.
Okay, yeah.
You know, yeah, on decaying wood, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
Flush those two once in a while.
Yeah. Yeah, they grow all over the United States. There's a handful of species. I can't tell any of them apart. They just look like little jelly kind of ears to me. I've actually never eaten them, but I hear they're pretty good, and you'll often find them in Asian markets. I know Andrew here has eaten them. Where's Andrew? Maybe he left. All right, old man of the woods. So this is what's called a bolete, and instead of the typical like blade-like gill structures you see in what we call the Agaricus, like the Macrosophy titans, these have these tubes on the underside of the cap, and a lot of the boletes tend to bruise just like a wide spectrum of colors. This one gets this like rusty orange-brown color when it's handled, and honestly it's a pretty ugly looking mushroom in my opinion, but it does taste pretty good. I tried it for the first time last year when I was in Georgia, and it was pretty good. I would say better than portobello. It had a similar taste, but there's something about it. Maybe I've just eaten too much portobello. Feel kind of jaded about it. But there's, I want to say at least 3 or 4 different species, and I cannot tell them apart, but they do have a pretty distinct look to them, and there's nothing you can really mistake them with. And yeah, these also have an extremely wide distribution.
They definitely blend in.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where do they like to grow?
Sorry?
Where do they like to grow?
So this was found in a mixed wood forest in South Florida. There was oak and pine. It's a mycorrhizal species, so it has a relationship with the roots of the trees. I'm inclined to say it's associated with the oak, but I'm not 100% sure. All right. So this one is a mouthful: Pulchra boletus rubicitrinus, or rubicitrinus. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a common name. But this is another bolete, and you can see it's got, the sponge-like fertile surface where you would typically see gills, and you can see, it's bruising the spectrum of coloration from blue to red. While they are extremely easy to identify, they get buggy extremely quick, and honestly, probably not worth eating any that are more mature than like this stage. Every time I've cut them open, it's just like filled with maggots. But they're a decent edible. Yeah. And then, okay, so who here has heard of the garden giant mushroom or wine caps? Okay, so it's another species that has the potential to get extremely big. They are commonly cultivated in gardens across the United States, though it's not native here in Florida. But I wanted to highlight this because, well, partially, it's extremely difficult to grow it here in Florida. I think it doesn't like the extreme heat. But last year, around this time, I think it was last year in May, I found these growing in my yard. And so when I first saw this, also let me back up. So I actually attempted to cultivate the wine caps in my yard in this one mulch patch. I never got anything out of it. And then in a separate mulch patch last year, I found these growing, and I was like, that's interesting. They look a lot like these wine caps that I planted, but I did not plant them in this bed. And so I still had the conviction that somehow they were wine caps, but something inside of me, I just had this hunch that maybe I should like dive a little deeper into them. And so I ended up getting them DNA sequenced, and while they did, the closest relative were the wine caps, they actually matched a species of Stropharia that was described from the Dominican Republic called Stropharia acanthostipitata. And it had never been found in Florida before, but I believe this is a potential tropical version of the wine caps that could easily be integrated into garden beds here in Florida as an alternative to typical wine caps. And since I found it, I've had one other friend find it 2 different times, again in mulch beds. I think he found his at a McDonald's, interestingly enough. Probably better food than what they're serving in there. So this is one I would really like to get into culture and distribute to different cultivators here in Florida. So hopefully more people who are into like gardening and food forests can integrate this into their yard and have another source of food. And yeah, so there's 3 observations in Florida, and then, maybe it wasn't the Dominican Republic. Where is it? Yeah, so I'm one of the 3 here in Florida, and then my buddy at UF, Andrew, he found the other 2 in Florida, but it's in Puerto Rico, and then, is that the Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so, all right, so Agaricus. Agaricus is the genus that the portobello mushrooms belong to. Everyone's familiar with these, but there are probably hundreds of Agaricus species that grow worldwide, and many of them are edible. We have a lot here in Florida, but this is one I actually found in my yard here in Deland. And so I sent it off to get DNA sequenced, and it didn't have any close matches, and so there's really no good name for it. So right now it's just going under Agaricus species FL04. And so something I really want to highlight is we don't know all of the edible mushrooms. I'm not sure if any of you have heard like the statistics on, how many fungal species we have mapped out worldwide relative to say like plant or animal species. but it's an extremely small percentage, and it's extremely easy to go out and find novel species of mushrooms that no one's ever seen before, that don't have names. And so this is a pretty good example of it. And then, yeah, so I've just got 3 observations all in my yard here in Deland. And, so March, September, and April. So spring and late summer, it seems that these guys pop up. But, okay, so has anyone here heard of iNaturalist? Is anyone familiar with that? Okay, like 4 people. So what this is, this map I'm showing, I'm sure a lot of you have seen these like apps on your phone where you can point your phone at, say, a plant or an animal or a mushroom, and it'll suggest something. So if any of you have those, throw it away, or delete it rather, and get iNaturalist. So iNaturalist does that, but it's not reliant on like this AI suggestion. What it does is every time you take a picture of, say, a mushroom or a plant, it'll attempt to make a identification, but then it posts it and associates it with a geolocation, and then other people can come in and suggest identifications. And actually there's a lot of experts who will spend, in my opinion, way too much time sifting through iNaturalist and identifying other people's observations for them. Another benefit of this is you can go in the search bar and you can search, say, mango trees and see every observation of a mango tree in the state of Florida, and then you can go to those spots and steal their mangoes.
What is that website again?
It's called iNaturalist. It's also an application on your phone that you can download, but the website definitely has a lot more functionality.
Is this one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the icon's a little green bird with a white background. Yeah. All right, so the Amanitas. I'm not going to advocate or suggest anyone attempt to pick and eat these, but the fact of the matter is the Amanitas, especially certain groups of or sections of Amanita, contain probably the most edible species out of any other genus here in the state of Florida. But Amanitas are extremely difficult to identify, and unless you become an expert or consult an expert, I would never suggest attempting foraging for them, especially, yeah.
It looks similar to one I've seen before.
Yeah.
It's called favorite ring mushroom.
Do you have like the scientific name?
I don't know the scientific.
Let's see. Oh, Marasmius aureates. Yeah, it's a little different. So Amanitas are mycorrhizal. So again, it's referring to this relationship they have with trees. The Marasmius aureates tends to grow in like lawns and like grassy areas. It's
parks.
Yeah, so it's saprophytic. It's just breaking down organic material, and it's not dependent on this symbiotic relationship with the tree. But Amanitas also, if you guys aren't aware, contain the what's called death caps or destroying angels, and there's probably, just in the state of Florida, at least 50 different species of deadly Amanita. But there's also probably more than 100 species of edible Amanita. So this is one example of an edible Amanita. It's in what's called Amanita section vaginate, and section vaginate contains, as far as I know, no deadly or toxic mushrooms, and the majority of them are choice edibles. And this is Amanita carolinensis, which actually isn't even an official name, it's just a temporary or provisional name. But here's another one of the deadly ones. So this is Amanita helmetensis, again another provisional name that's not officially published. But this is one of the death caps or destroying angels. It belongs in Amanita section Phalloideae. And then, so this one, does anyone, I mean, I have the captions there, but is anyone familiar with this mushroom? Does it look familiar? Yeah, so this is like the archetypal mushroom. You know, you see it in Mario, it's associated with fairy tales. And in most of the world, it's called Amanita muscaria, but the species we have here in Florida is called Amanita persicina, and it refers to the peach-ish colored cap it has, where true Amanita muscaria has like a deeply pigmented like red cap. And so this is an example of a mushroom that kind of blurs the line between toxic and edible. So this mushroom is actually psychoactive or hallucinogenic.
When carefully prepared.
When carefully, yes, thank you. But you can also boil it and render the psychoactive compounds, muscimol and ibotenic acid, inert, and consume it as an edible. And apparently it's extremely good. I have not eaten them myself. Have you eaten them? No. Yeah, so this one kind of blurs the line, and that's another thing I want to emphasize with this. Like, there's a lot of mushrooms that are really good choice edibles, like the ones you'd find at the market. And then there's a lot of mushrooms that are just kind of like, okay, what I would call famine food. If you're like desperate and you need something to eat and you're capable of identifying it, you can eat it. And then you have honestly, the majority of mushrooms kind of fall into a category where they're not toxic, but they're either too small or neutral tasting to even be worth like seeking out and collecting as a food. And then of course you have like the truly toxic / deadly mushrooms that you do need to be aware of. Also, if anyone has questions, you can just kind of blurt them out or whatever.
I seen on a website for a mushroom group a couple weeks ago, they were actually doing like citizen science, and they were eating chlorophyllum molly bites, like the vomiter, to see if it made them sick. And it didn't make them sick, but I'm not suggesting eating them.
Right. Well, the question is, how much do they eat?
Right. Was it maybe the real parasol mushroom?
I'll send you the link.
They were misidentifiing them?
Potentially.
Yeah, those are vomiters.
Oh, yeah.
The compound that causes sickness has been scientifically identified. They linked the paper in the post,
Yeah.
and it's dependent on boiling time. Because the chemical is inactivated if it's above 80 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes.
What are you giving a talk here?
I'm thinking famine food, you know. not
Yeah,
healthy
yeah.
famine food.
Again, consume at your own risk.
So yeah, that's that. And then okay, so yeah, that kind of covers the basic, pretty easy to get into edible mushrooms. But if you really want to figure out how to identify mushrooms, there's no rule of thumb with edible mushrooms. Like, oh, if it's this, you can eat. You really have to dive into it. And so using a combination of resources is honestly the best approach. And the first time you go out in an attempt to forage edible mushrooms, I would suggest avoiding actually getting to the point of eating them. I would go out, collect the mushrooms, take really good pictures in a habitat, and go from there and utilize a combination of field guides, iNaturalist, Facebook groups, or consulting some kind of expert or sorry? Yeah. So actually, I kind of have like pet peeve with spore prints. So they are useful, but honestly, they don't tell you much at all. It's just one diagnostic that can contribute to an identification, but actually, with one exception, there's only one mushroom where a spore print would tell you exactly what species it is, and it's Chlorophyllum molybdites, because it's, as far as I know, the only mushroom on the planet that contains green colored truly green colored spores.
Yeah.
So that'd be the one exception. But other than that, the spore color doesn't carry a lot of weight. Now, if you were to take those spores and look at them under a microscope, that's a different story. I don't know, it just kind of irks me when I see people online going, oh, take a spore print and you'll know what it is. It's like,
It's just like one of the things you do.
right. And you have to use a combination of diagnostics to get to the point of like of accurate identification. But yeah, all of these things, field guides, iNaturalist, and Facebook groups are good. So like I said earlier, iNaturalist, you can put up any form of life. It could be a fungus, a bacteria, animals. I actually have a friend who anytime he's in the woods and he sees litter or urine bottles or used condoms, he will take a picture of it and he'll upload it as a Homo sapien observation, which I find pretty amusing. And yeah, you can search for any organism and see its distribution on a map. You can see exactly where it is. It does also allow you to obscure your observation. So if you have that like prime honeypot spot of chanterelles and you don't want people to know exactly where it is, you can obscure it to just like the city or the county or even state level. So you don't have to give the exact coordinates, or you can make it completely private. Like I said, it has AI suggestions, and with a lot of the common species, it is pretty good. Like, it would get Amanita persicina, it would probably get Old Man of the Woods, probably the Seagrape chanterelles, but for a lot of them, you'll only get to like the family or genus with it. And I like to say it's like a real life Pokedex, if anyone gets the Pokemon reference. And yeah, so you can also, another neat thing that I find about it, so these are all my observations in the United States, and a lot of the times I like going back and looking at photos I've taken in these places, and it kind of rekindles memories and associations I have with being there, and you know, the nice river I swam in and right next to the mushroom patch, so that's kind of neat. All right, Facebook groups. So yeah, there's one for pretty much any state or region in the United States. This is by far the quickest way to get responses on what your mushroom is. Unfortunately, this also means you'll get people telling you how bad of a photo you've taken and how you need to take closer pictures and the gills and not blurry and but yeah, you'll get extremely quick responses, and just like iNaturalist, there's a lot of people who spend way too much time on Facebook, and this also includes experts, and so it also makes it easy to connect with other local mushroom people. And yeah, a couple examples, at least for Florida, there's one group called Edible Mushrooms Florida, South Florida Mushrooms. I think there's a Central Florida Mushrooms one. There's a Florida Mushroom Identification Group. And then recently, a couple people in this room and I have started an initiative to create a Florida Mushroom Club, and it's called the Florida Mycological Society. And we do have a Facebook page, though we are going to kind of shy away from turning it into a mushroom identification group just because there's more than enough of them.
Are you guys gonna do like walks and stuff?
Yeah, so the first Sunday of every month, we're gonna do a walk. We did one this month. Next month, I think it's July 7th, we're doing it at the St. Francis Yellow Trail, just west of Deland here. So if you want to be updated on that, you can join the Facebook group. I believe someone also started an Instagram page for it, but it's just Florida Mycological Society. And yeah, July 7th, it falls on a Sunday. St. Francis Yellow Trail. Field guides. So field guides are great because they provide extremely in-depth descriptions of various species. It also has a glossary, which functions as a really good tool for learning the different terms that they're using to describe the mushrooms. So that's great. It doesn't require Wi-Fi, unlike all these other tools. So you can bring it with you into the woods, and you can potentially identify things in real time. But no field guide will ever have every single species in a given region. There's just too many. Also, like I said earlier, we don't have names for a lot of mushroom species, and so it's impossible to include things that you can't even talk about in a field guide. So it's not none of these things individually are anything I would rely solely on, but rather, like I said, using a combination of these things is the best approach. And so here's a couple pretty good ones for the Southeast. My favorite is mushrooms of the Gulf Coast states. And I actually have a copy of it up here. If anyone wants to take a look after this talk, you're welcome to. And then another pretty decent one is mushrooms of the Southeast, and then psilocybin mushrooms of the world. Not necessarily covering edible ones, but that's debatable because I hear a lot of the psilocybin ones are edible and taste pretty good when you cook them. This is just hammering what I just said, using a combination. So like I mentioned with the Facebook group thing and people telling you about your photos, you really want to make sure you get high quality photos in habitat. You want to know, is it growing on wood? What tree species are nearby? Oak, pine, sweet gum, etc. These are all diagnostic characteristics that contribute and help land you at a final determination about what you're looking at. Getting a picture of the mushroom in its entirety, including the base of the stem. This is particularly important with Amanitas, because the Amanitas, at the base of the stem, they have this egg-like sac called a vulva, and it's usually below the surface of the soil. And with those, it's extremely helpful to be able to see the shape and texture of that vulva. What it's growing out of, any notable chemical reactions like bruising. So with the boletes, they bruise the spectrum of colors. So noting that, and something really useful to do to see that is to create a cross section with a knife of the mushroom. So just cutting it in half, opening it up, and looking and watching its internal flesh change colors. And then something for size reference, a lot of people will use lighters or coins. This just gives you an idea of how big it is. So this is a decent example. So you'll see I have some of them bisected here, and you can see this bluing orange coloration that's occurring. And actually the orange coloration, it's interesting because it's only where there's insect damage. So this one, where the insects bruise it, it's turning orange, but where I slice it with a knife, it turns blue. So that's kind of interesting, and that's actually pretty common.
It's the acid from their excretion.
Is it? Okay, I didn't know that.
So is it edible?
This one I have a picture of? Yes, so this was the one I mentioned earlier called Pulchroboletus rubicitrinus, the one that is a pain name. Also getting, if there's a really good collection or fruiting of the mushrooms, getting them at different stages of development is really important. So you can see here I've got them when they're really young before the cap is fully opened, and I've got them, this one where the tubes on the underside are starting to get bug damage and rot. It's extremely helpful. An example of a scale bar, I bring this little ruler that I picked up at a knitting shop around. And then if anyone here is inclined, I mentioned an organization earlier called the Ohio Mushroom DNA Lab, and they're offering free DNA sequencing for the entire United States, actually all of North America. And if you really want to get a precise identification of your mushroom, you can take advantage of this. And if this is something you're interested in, you can talk to me after and I can set you up with how you would go about that. But this is something I'm extremely passionate about, is getting Florida mushrooms DNA sequenced so that we can create like an outline of the biodiversity of fungi in the state of Florida. Like I said earlier, most mushrooms in the world don't have names. They are unknown to science. We don't know, like anything, there's more we don't know about them than there is we know about them. And one of my kind of longer term goals is to get like a really in-depth outline of all the macro fungi here in the state of Florida. But something that a nice tool you can bring out into the field if you are collecting mushrooms is a tackle box. And I would suggest ventilated tackle box. This allows you to kind of organize your different mushroom collections and not get them mixed up. A lot of people bring baskets, and that's great if you're familiar with what you're collecting. If you're just targeting chanterelles and you know how to identify them and you're strictly wanting to just eat them when you get home, a basket or a brown paper bag is fine. But if you're going out to collect different species of mushrooms and you want to keep them separate, because mixed collections can be an issue, especially if you want to eat some of the mushrooms, that could lead to trouble. So tackle box is nice. And then dehydrating them for preservation when you get home so they don't get moldy. You can actually, if you're like me and you spend whole days out, going from your kind of trail hopping, trail to trail, in between trails, I'll put my tackle box on top of my dashboard of my car, and at least in the Florida heat, it'll quickly start dehydrating. I also like bringing little numbered slips out that I just kind of write out manually and I number them. And so I'll take a picture with the mushroom with the slip, and then I'll put that slip in the tackle box slot with the mushrooms so that I know which is which, especially because once they start dehydrating, they can start looking the same as they dry, and then it's like, oh well, which one is this? And then another thing you can get into if you really want to level up your identification game is microscopy. That's a deep rabbit hole that I'm not going to go into. But then as far as long-term storage, labeled Ziploc bag with a desiccant pack. And then if you do find something that's extremely interesting and worth preserving for future study, you can do what's called accessioning them or cataloging them at your state herbarium or fungarium is what we call it, where they store the mushrooms. And so there's a really good one at University of Florida. It's one of the largest in the country. And so a lot of my really interesting novel species I'll end up sending there so that other researchers who potentially study a certain family or genus can, get a loan of my collection and they can study it themselves and maybe put a name on it. And then, Ohio Mushroom DNA Lab, that's Kyle on the left. Like I said, if you're interested in that, you can talk to me after. And that's it. That's my talk.